In 1965, when Harlem was a powder keg of social unrest and economic inequality, Detective Roy Hanley made a decision that would seal his fate. He thought his badge made him untouchable. He believed that by framing a man like Bumpy Johnson, a man whose reputation was built on respect and honor, he could eliminate a threat and rise even higher in his corrupt world. What Hanley didn't know was that he had just taken the first step into a trap that would unravel his entire life. He had no idea that he was about to face the legend of Harlem, a man whose code of justice was unbreakable and who always had the last word. Detective Roy Hanley was a man who wore his badge like armor, using it to bully and intimidate those who stood in his way. With slicked back hair and a permanent sneer, Hanley thought of himself as the law in Harlem. He'd bent the system for years, taking bribes and manipulating evidence for the highest bidder. To him, people were just pawns in his game of power, and no one could touch him, not the criminals he shook down, not the politicians he blackmailed, and certainly not Bumpy Johnson, the most powerful man in Harlem. But Hanley made one mistake. He didn't understand the street code. He didn't understand respect. He didn't know that crossing Bumpy Johnson would lead to his downfall. Bumpy was not a man to be pushed around. And when Hanley framed him for a murder he didn't commit, he signed his own death sentence, not physically, but professionally. Hanley's arrogance blinded him to the fact that Bumpy's connections were vast and his reach extended far beyond the streets of Harlem. The people knew Bumpy didn't just run the neighborhood, he owned it. And now, Hanley had made the fatal mistake of assuming his badge would protect him. The night Hanley framed Bumpy was one full of greed, deception, and a thirst for more power. Bumpy had been a man of the streets for decades, but more than that, he was a symbol of justice to the people. He stood as a pillar of stability in a community that had long been ignored and oppressed. By framing him for the murder of a high-profile political figure, Hanley had threatened to take that away. What made the situation even worse was that the cop had chosen to frame Bumpy during a time of heightened racial tension. The streets were already on edge, and Bumpy was a leader in the fight for justice. Hanley, who felt invincible, saw an opportunity to rid himself of a major obstacle, thinking that no one would dare question the law. But Bumpy, always calculating, always ready, was a man who understood that no betrayal ever goes unpunished. This wasn't just about the murder. It was about honor, respect, and the deep line Hanley had crossed when he framed the man who protected his community. The trap was set, and the clock was ticking. It started when Roy Hanley saw an opportunity that he couldn't resist. He'd been watching Bumpy Johnson for weeks, trying to find some way to put him down. Bumpy had recently made a move that had upset some of the city's most powerful, pushing back against a corrupt deal involving a major construction project that threatened to gentrify Harlem. Hanley, who was working for the developers behind the project, saw an opening. One night, after Bumpy had attended a meeting at the local diner with his men, Hanley set his plan into motion. He planted evidence that linked Bumpy to the murder of a prominent politician, someone whose death would benefit the developers he was working for. Hanley knew that framing Bumpy for this crime would put him behind bars for good, and with Bumpy out of the way, the developers would have a clear path to proceed with their plans. Bumpy, however, had made a habit of moving in the shadows. While Hanley was busy plotting his frame-up, Bumpy was on the streets doing what he did best, protecting his people, keeping an ear to the ground, and making sure that no one, not even a cop, could push him around. What Hanley didn't know was that Emma Hayes, Bumpy's trusted associate, had witnessed part of the setup. Emma, who had been working as an informant for Bumpy, had seen Hanley planting the murder weapon in the politician's office. As soon as she got the information, she ran straight to Bumpy. Bumpy's reaction was calm, but firm. "This cop thinks he can take me down, but he doesn't know the first thing about respect," he said. "We're going to turn the tables on him." Bumpy wasn't the type to act rashly, so when he learned that a corrupt cop was behind the plot to frame him, he didn't go into a blind rage. Instead, he assessed the situation with a cold, calculating mind. He knew that reacting impulsively would only play into Hanley's hands. Bumpy took a deep breath, sitting back in his chair with his fingers steepled in front of him. Life is about choices, and sometimes you have to make the right one, Bumpy said, his voice low and measured. I've lived by a code my entire life, and this cop is about to learn that crossing the line has consequences. He thinks his badge makes him untouchable. Well, the badge doesn't give you respect. The streets do. And that's something he'll never have. Bumpy's crew stood by, silent but ready to move. They knew that when Bumpy spoke, it wasn't just words. It was a plan that would unfold with precision. In that moment, they all understood. Hanley had no idea who he was messing with. As the days passed, Hanley grew increasingly confident in his position. The evidence was planted, and the case against Bumpy seemed airtight. He walked through the precinct with his head held high, smiling at the thought of what he thought would be Bumpy's imminent downfall. The city was buzzing with the news of Bumpy's arrest, and Hanley savored the moment. But while Hanley felt secure, Bumpy was moving in silence, preparing the trap. He knew he couldn't just fight the law through conventional means. He had to hit Hanley where it would hurt most: his career, his reputation, and his pride. The corrupt cop had made one fatal error. He underestimated how far Bumpy would go to restore honor to Harlem. Bumpy wasn't just fighting for his freedom, he was fighting for the soul of the streets. Every move Hanley made only brought him closer to the realization that his own downfall was near. The silence was thick with tension, each day ticking by like a time bomb. Hanley, blind to the storm coming his way, continued to operate with the false confidence of someone who thought they were untouchable. The final pieces were falling into place. Bumpy's team had been gathering evidence of Hanley's corruption for months. They had connected him to several shady deals with the city's developers, including bribery, money laundering, and coercion. But Bumpy wasn't going to release it all at once. Instead, he carefully timed the reveal. He knew that exposing Hanley's criminal ties at the right moment would not only destroy him, but also send a message to anyone else who thought they could take advantage of Harlem's people. The stage was set. All Bumpy had to do now was wait for the right time. It was Friday, July 2nd, at precisely 10:30 a.m. when Detective Roy Hanley walked into his office, as he did every day. He had no idea that today would be different. As he sat behind his desk, sorting through paperwork, he noticed a familiar face entering his office without knocking. It was Bumpy Johnson. Hanley's eyes narrowed in immediate disbelief, and his hand instinctively moved toward his gun, but Bumpy was already in the chair across from him. There was no rush, no tension in Bumpy's posture. Just a calm, assured presence that sent a chill through the room. Hanley's arrogance started to bubble to the surface. "Do you know who I am?" he sneered, his voice thick with entitlement. Bumpy simply leaned back in his chair and looked at him, his face unreadable. "I don't need to know who you are, Roy, but I do know what you've done." For a moment, Hanley couldn't comprehend what Bumpy meant. "What the hell are you talking about?" he demanded, standing up now, trying to intimidate Bumpy with his presence. "You think you can walk in here and threaten me? I've got the law on my side. I've got your life in my hands." Bumpy's eyes were ice cold as he looked up at him, the power in his gaze cutting through Hanley's bluster. "You framed me for murder. You thought you could take me down, but you forgot one thing. I don't play by the same rules you do." In that instant, Hanley's arrogance crumbled. He saw Bumpy's face calm but dangerous, and he realized too late that this wasn't a confrontation he could win. Before Hanley could say another word, Bumpy continued, his voice slow and steady. You think the badge gives you power, but real power comes from respect, and you lost that the moment you put my name in your lies. Hanley's breath caught in his throat, and his hand shook as he reached for the phone, but it was too late. The room's door flew open, and in walked Emma Hayes, carrying a thick manila envelope. She placed it down on Hanley's desk, the contents visible for him to see. Hanley's face went pale as he recognized the documents. Files connecting him to a series of bribes, extortion, and other criminal dealings with the developers. The trap was sprung. You were right about one thing, Hanley, Bumpy said with a cold smile. You've got the law, but I've got the streets, and the streets know everything. Bumpy stood up, never breaking his gaze from Hanley. The cop was sweating now, realizing his entire career, his freedom, everything he had worked for was about to come crashing down. Your little game is over, Bumpy said, his voice now laced with finality. You'll never wear that badge again. In the next 24 hours, Bumpy's team would release the evidence. The story would spread through Harlem and beyond. The corrupt cop would be exposed, his career destroyed. The politicians who'd been backing him would distance themselves, and Hanley's name would be mud in every precinct in the city. But what struck Hanley the hardest wasn't just the exposure of his corruption. It was the realization that he'd been outplayed by a man he thought he could destroy. The law didn't protect him. It didn't matter that he had power. It only mattered that he had no respect. And Bumpy Johnson, the man who lived by a code of justice, had made sure that Hanley would never forget who truly controlled the streets. The impact of Hanley's downfall rippled through Harlem and beyond. The people who had once feared the corrupt officer now saw Bumpy Johnson as a protector, a man who stood up for what was right. Hanley's career was in shambles. He was dismissed from the force, facing criminal charges, and quickly became a pariah in law enforcement. His life, built on the arrogance of his badge, was gone in an instant. But the community, the very people Hanley had tried to oppress, had found a new sense of justice. They had seen what happened when someone crossed Bumpy Johnson, and it wasn't just about the consequences for the wrongdoer. It was a lesson for everyone. No one was above respect. No one was above the code of the streets. Bumpy never needed to say much after that. His legend continued to grow, and his actions spoke louder than any words ever could. What would you do if someone tried to frame you for something you didn't do? Would you stay silent, or would you fight back with everything you've got? Bumpy Johnson didn't just fight back, he delivered justice with precision, making sure the world knew who truly held the power. If this story hit you, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Bumpy Johnson stories history forgot, the moments that made him a legend, the code that made him untouchable. Drop a like if you think Bumpy was the smartest man in Harlem. And in the comments, what would you have done if you were Detective Hanley? More legendary stories coming next day. Don't miss it.